Hello everyone, welcome to Folktales with Sassy. Brian Adewale, he adjusted the cuffs of his crisp white shirt as he stared at his father in disbelief. They sat in the lavish study of their Ikoe mansion, a room lined with mahogany bookshelves, marble flooring, and expensive artwork. Normally, Brian loved this space. It was quiet, powerful, and filled with the scent of aged books and leather. But today, the room felt suffocating. You can't be serious, Brian said, his voice laced with frustration. Chief Adewale, one of Nigeria's most powerful businessmen, leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled together. I'm very serious, Brian. You've spent your entire life in privilege, surrounded by wealth. It's time you see how the real world works. Brian scoffed. And you think sending me to some rundown public school is the way to do that? His mother, a softer voice of reason, placed a hand on his shoulder. Sweetheart, your father just wants you to understand the struggles of ordinary people. Brian clenched his jaw. He had spent all his life in elite private schools where his last name carried weight. Now he was expected to enroll in Kingsway Public High School, a place he had only heard about in passing, usually in a negative way. Chief Adewale's gaze hardened. No driver, no special treatment, no allowance beyond what an average student gets. You will experience life as a normal person, and no one must know who you really are. Brian opened his mouth to protest again, but knew it was useless. His father had made up his mind. This was going to be a disaster. The first thing Brian noticed about Kingsway Public High School was the state of the buildings. The walls were cracked, the classrooms overcrowded, and the schoolyard unpaved. It was nothing like the polished halls of his old private school. He adjusted his second-hand uniform. It felt rough compared to the designer blazers he was used to. He had ditched his expensive wristwatch and replaced his name-brand sneakers with ordinary black shoes. Students milled about, laughing and chatting in small groups. Some glanced at him, their eyes filled with curiosity. He could feel them sizing him up, trying to determine if he was friend or foe. Then he saw her. Chichi. She stood with her arms crossed, her sharp brown eyes assessing him. Unlike the other girls in school, she wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wore her uniform like armor, and her expression told him she had little patience for nonsense. New kid, huh? She said, tilting her head. Brian hesitated before nodding. Yeah, Brian. Her gaze swept over him. You sure you belong here, fancy boy? He forced a casual smile. Guess I'll find out. She smirked. Good luck with that. And just like that, Brian knew this school wasn't just a change. It was going to be a challenge. Brian quickly learned that Kingsway High had an unspoken hierarchy, and respect was not given freely. Unlike his former school, where students measured status by wealth, here, it was about survival. During lunch, Brian found himself standing alone with his tray of food, scanning the cafeteria for an empty seat. He noticed Chichi sitting with a group of students, laughing and talking animatedly. Taking a deep breath, he walked over. Can I sit here? He asked. Chichi raised an eyebrow. You sure you belong at this table, fancy boy? Her friends chuckled. Brian smirked. I guess I'll find out. Chichi studied him for a moment, then shrugged. Suit yourself. As he sat down, he felt the weight of their gazes. This wasn't going to be easy, but he was determined to fit in. Unlike his old school, where students had everything handed to them, Kingsway High students hustled. Brian noticed that students sold everything: snacks, secondhand books, even mobile phone data. Everyone was trying to make money to survive. Chichi was one of the best hustlers. During breaks, she sold homemade snacks, moving through the school like a business tycoon. One afternoon, Brian approached her as she counted her earnings. You do this every day? She gave him a look. Not all of us have rich parents to fall back on. Her words stung more than she knew. For the first time, Brian started to wonder, what would I do if I had nothing? Brian's struggle to adapt took a new turn when he accidentally offended the wrong person, Jide, the school bully. Hey, rich boy, Jide sneered, cornering Brian behind the classroom after school. Think you're better than us? Brian clenched his fist, ready to defend himself. But before he could react, Chichi appeared. Leave him alone, she said firmly. Jide laughed. Since when do you protect rich boys? Since now, she replied. Brian watched in shock as Jide backed off. As they walked away, Brian looked at her, impressed. Thanks. Chichi smirked. Don't get used to it. Over the next few weeks, Brian and Chichi's paths kept crossing. Whether it was in class, at lunch, or during after-school activities, they found themselves talking more. Chichi had a sharp mind and a quick wit. She could argue for hours about business, leadership, and life, and Brian found himself enjoying their conversations. He admired how fiercely independent she was, how she never let anyone walk over her. One afternoon, she caught him struggling with a math problem. Move, she said, sliding into the seat next to him. You're doing it all wrong. Brian smirked. I thought you didn't like me. I don't, she shot back, rolling her eyes. But I can't stand watching someone be this clueless. As she explained the problem, Brian found himself more interested in watching her than in solving the equation. There was something about her, something real. Maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to like her. Brian's secret was becoming harder to keep. One afternoon, as he pulled out an expensive leather wallet to pay for food, Chichi frowned. Where did you get that? She asked. Brian hesitated. It was a gift. Chichi didn't look convinced. That doesn't look like something a broke student would own. Brian forced a laugh. I got lucky. She narrowed her eyes but didn't push. But deep down, Brian knew it was only a matter of time before she started asking real questions. A school field trip to a local farm was supposed to be a fun, practical learning experience. For Brian, it was a nightmare. From the moment he was handed a hoe, he struggled. His muscles ached, his hands blistered, and he was drenched in sweat. Chichi, watching him struggle, shook her head. You've really never done this before, huh? Brian groaned. Nope. I think I was born allergic to hard work. She smirked, then handed him a bottle of water. Time to learn. As they worked together, Brian realized something surprising. He didn't hate this. For the first time in a long time, he felt normal. Chichi had a sharp mind, and Brian's small slip-ups weren't going unnoticed. She noticed how his accent sometimes slipped into something more polished, how he seemed strangely familiar with business concepts, how he carried himself with a certain air of confidence, one that didn't match the struggling student image he projected. One evening, she decided to follow him after school. What she saw left her stunned. Brian climbed into a sleek black car, a luxury vehicle no ordinary student could afford. The driver opened the door for him, and just like that, he was gone. Chichi clenched her fists. Who was Brian, really? Brian finally confessed. I'm Brian Adewale, son of Chief Adewale, the owner of Adewale Group. Chichi's heart pounded. So this was all a joke to you? Playing poor just to see how normal people live? No, Brian said quickly. It wasn't like that. My father wanted me to learn the value of life beyond money. But Chichi's face was unreadable. You lied to me, she whispered. Before he could say another word, she turned and walked away. Brian had never felt so helpless in his life. Chichi avoided Brian for days. It wasn't just about the lie, it was about what it represented. She had spent her whole life fighting against the privileged, against people who had everything handed to them, and now she had unknowingly let one of them into her heart. Brian tried to approach her, but she brushed him off at every turn. It's better this way, she told herself. But if that were true, why did it hurt so much? Word spread quickly. Once people found out who Brian really was, the reactions were mixed. Some students, including the school bully Jide, now resented him more than ever. Others tried to get close to him, hoping for favors or money. Brian felt like he had lost the one thing he had gained at Kingsway, an identity beyond his father's wealth. And worse, he had lost Chichi's trust. It was only a matter of time before Jeed acted on his grudge. You think you can just play poor and then go back to your mansion? He sneered, cornering Brian after school. Brian clenched his fists. I never pretended to be poor. I just wanted to experience life differently. Jide scoffed. Experience this. The first punch landed on Brian's jaw, sending him stumbling. Before Jeed could swing again, a voice cut through the air. Enough! Brian looked up. It was Chichi. Chichi had no idea why she stepped in. Maybe it was because she still cared, despite everything. Or maybe she hated seeing Jeed act like he was better than anyone. Leave him alone, she said coldly. Jeed hesitated, then smirked. Fine, but don't think this is over, rich boy. As Jide walked away, Brian looked at Chichi. Why did you help me? He asked. She hesitated, then sighed. I don't know. And with that, she turned and walked away. Brian knew he had to make things right. One evening, he found Chichi sitting alone on the school's rooftop. I never wanted to hurt you, he said softly. Chichi sighed. I know, but it's hard to trust someone who hid something so big. I want to prove to you that I'm more than my father's money, Brian said. Tell me how. Chichi thought for a moment. Start by helping others, she said. If you really want to understand life beyond money, then use what you have to make a difference. Brian nodded, and just like that, a new chapter in his journey began. Brian sat alone in his room that night, replaying Chichi's words in his head. Start by helping others. If you really want to understand life beyond money, then use what you have to make a difference. He had spent his entire life being handed everything. But what had he earned? The next day, he went to the principal's office with an idea. Sir, I want to start a scholarship fund for students who can't afford their fees. The principal raised an eyebrow. And how do you plan to do that? Brian hesitated. He couldn't use his father's money. That would defeat the purpose. I'll raise the funds myself, he said with determination. The principal studied him, then nodded. All right, let's see what you can do. This was it. His first real test. Brian had always watched Chichi hustle, selling snacks, organizing small tutoring sessions for extra cash. Now it was his turn. He started small, fixing students' broken shoes for a small fee. Then he expanded, offering to teach English and business studies to struggling students. At first, no one took him seriously. Rich boy thinks he can be one of us, someone sneered. But Brian didn't give up. Slowly, people started coming to him, not because of his name, but because they saw he was serious. Chichi watched from afar, still skeptical. Maybe he's actually changing, she thought. One evening, as Chichi closed her small snack stand, she found Brian waiting nearby. You're really doing this, she said, arms folded. Brian nodded. I promised I'd prove myself. She studied him for a moment, then sighed. Maybe I was wrong about you. Brian's heart skipped a beat. Was she finally starting to trust him again? Just as things were improving, Brian's past came knocking. One evening, his father's assistant arrived with the letter. You are cordially invited to the Adewale Foundation annual gala. It was a huge event filled with the wealthiest families in Lagos. His father expected him to attend. Brian sighed. This was the life he had tried to escape. But what if he could use the gala for something more? Brian met with his father at their family estate. I'll come to the gala, he said, but I want something in return. Chief Adewale smirked. Let me guess. Money? Brian shook his head. Not for me. I need funding for a scholarship program at Kingsway High. His father raised an eyebrow. Why do you care about those students? Because I've seen what they go through. They deserve a chance. For the first time, his father seemed intrigued. Fine, but if I do this, you come back to the family business after graduation. Brian swallowed. This was a deal with the devil. But if it meant helping his classmates, he had no choice. Deal, he said. The night of the gala, Brian felt like a stranger in his own world. The room was filled with men in tailored suits, women in glittering gowns, and the constant clinking of champagne glasses. As his father introduced him to powerful businessmen, he played along, but all he could think about was Chichi. Would she be proud of him if she saw him here? Then an idea struck him. What if I invite Chichi? The next day, Brian found Chichi at school. I want you to come to the gala with me, he said. Chichi blinked. You're joking, right? No, I want you to see my world. She hesitated. I don't belong there. Brian smiled. Neither do I. After much convincing, she finally agreed. But I don't have a dress, she muttered. Leave that to me. The night of the gala, Brian waited outside Chichi's house. When she stepped out, he felt his breath hitch. She wasn't wearing anything overly extravagant, just a simple but elegant dress, but it was her, confident, strong, and breathtaking. You look amazing, Brian said. Chichi rolled her eyes. Don't get used to it. But as she got into the car, she couldn't ignore the way her heart pounded. At the gala, all eyes were on Chichi. People whispered, "Who is she?" Brian ignored them. He was proud to have her by his side. But when his father approached, the atmosphere changed. Ah, Brian, Chief Adewale said, his gaze settling on Chichi. And who is your guest? Chichi met his gaze, unfazed. I'm Chichi. Nice to meet you, sir. The tension in the room was palpable. Would his father accept her, or would this night end in disaster? Brian's father pulled him aside, his grip firm on his arm. I see what you're doing, Chief Adewale said coldly. That girl, she doesn't belong in our world. Brian clenched his jaw. She's more than that girl, Dad. His father's expression darkened. Listen to me, Brian. If you continue this foolishness, you will be cut off. The words hit Brian like a slap. He had expected resistance, but to be disowned? Brian met his father's gaze. So, you want me to be just like you, marry the right kind of girl, do what you tell me for the rest of my life. That's how power works, his father said coolly. You don't throw it away for childish emotions. Brian's fists clenched. If this is power, I don't want it. Chief Adewale took a slow breath. Then you'll have nothing. Brian's heart pounded in his chest. He had never imagined having to choose between love and the life he had always known. But deep down, he already knew his answer. When Brian found Chichi at school the next day, he told her everything. I told my father I won't abandon you, he said, even if it means losing everything. Chichi sighed, rubbing her temples. Brian, this isn't just about us. Your father will come after you. You don't understand the kind of man he is. Brian took her hands. I don't care. I'll work. I'll start over. As long as I have you. She pulled away. Don't make me your rebellion, Brian. What does that mean? His voice was desperate. Chichi exhaled sharply. You're trying to prove a point, but I don't want to be the reason you burn your entire life down. This isn't a fairy tale, Brian. Love doesn't pay the bills. Her words stung. So, you're leaving me? Chichi shook her head. I just don't want to be a pawn in this war between you and your father. Figure out who you are first, without me. Brian watched her walk away. He had made his choice, but it seemed Chichi wasn't ready to make hers. Jide had been watching everything from a distance, and a smirk formed on his face. Rich boy thinks he's one of us now, he muttered to his crew. Let's see how long that lasts. Jide had never liked Brian, and now that everyone knew the truth, the school's tension had shifted. Some admired Brian for choosing his own path. Others, like Jide, saw it as an opportunity. Later that day, Brian found a note in his locker. Meet me behind the old classroom. Urgent. It wasn't signed. Thinking it was Chichi, Brian rushed there. The moment he stepped behind the building, he knew he had made a mistake. Jide and his gang were waiting. You should have stayed in your mansion, rich boy, Jide sneered. Brian barely had time to react before the first punch hit his stomach. He staggered back, gasping. Another blow came to his jaw, the taste of blood filling his mouth. But just as Jide raised his fist again, a voice roared through the air. Get away from him! Chichi! She came flying at Jide, shoving him back. The raw fury in her eyes made even Jide hesitate. You want to fight? She snapped. Fight someone who isn't afraid of you. Jide sneered but stepped back. This isn't over. As Jide and his crew walked away, Chichi turned to Brian, her expression unreadable. You're an idiot, she muttered. Why would you fall for that trap? Brian groaned. Thought it was you. Chichi rolled her eyes but crouched beside him. Come on, let's get you cleaned up. For the first time since their fight, Brian saw something in her eyes. Worry. Maybe she still cared. But before Brian could say anything, a terrifying scream echoed from the schoolyard. Students ran toward the front gate, a wave of panic moving through the crowd. Chichi and Brian followed, their hearts pounding. And then they saw it. A wrecked motorcycle, blood on the pavement. A student lay motionless in the middle of the road. Chichi's hands flew to her mouth. No, 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 no. It was Tunde, her closest friend. Brian grabbed her arm. Chichi, wait! But she ran. She dropped to her knees beside Tunde, shaking him, but his eyes didn't open. A teacher was already on the phone, calling an ambulance. The driver who had hit him stood frozen, horror on his face. Brian swallowed hard. Tunde had been like a brother to Chichi. If he didn't survive, everything would change. Hours passed in a blur at the hospital. Brian sat beside Chichi in the waiting room. She hadn't spoken since they arrived. Then the doctor walked out. Brian felt Chichi's whole body tense beside him. I'm sorry, the doctor said softly. We did everything we could. The words hit like a punch. Chichi stood backing away. Her face was blank. Brian reached for her, but she flinched. Chichi! She shook her head. I need to be alone. And she walked away. Brian felt helpless. He had just gotten her back, and now she was slipping away again. The funeral was a week later. The whole school attended. Chichi stood at the front, silent, unblinking, her hands balled into fists. When it was time to speak, she finally stepped forward. Her voice was calm, too calm. Tunde was the best person I knew, she said, and now he's gone. Her fingers clenched tighter. And what did he die for? A reckless driver? A city that doesn't care about people like us? She turned, eyes burning. This world is broken, and we're the ones paying the price. Brian had never seen her like this. When she stepped down, she didn't look at him. After the funeral, Brian found her standing alone behind the church. Chichi? She closed her eyes. Don't, Brian. Just don't. You don't have to go through this alone, he pleaded. She let out a bitter laugh. That's the thing, Brian. I always do. She finally turned to him. Go back to your life. Fix things with your father. Do whatever you have to do. What about us? He whispered. Her eyes softened for just a second, then hardened again. There is no us, she said. And just like that, she walked away. Brian stood there, heart shattered. She was gone.